Hello and welcome. We are happy you are joining us today, and I do hope you're having a constructive day and not being greatly impacted by all the powerful weather or ransomware attacks that are all around us. So we're going to take an hour to just relax and gain some information. So I'm your host, Charles Collegy, the security analyst for Accelerated Strategies Group. And today's Security Boulevard webinar is brought to you by Cyril. Today, we have Rob Richardson, a developer advocate with Cyril, and he'll be speaking on Leaky 3 buckets. So Rob, if you could just take a moment to introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, most definitely. I'm Rob Richardson, a developer advocate for Cyril. Thanks for the introduction. Here's some of the things that I've done recently. I'm a Microsoft MVP, a friend of Redgate, a Cyril developer advocate. And let me tell you about AZ Give Camp. AZ Give Camp brings volunteer developers together with charities who otherwise couldn't afford software. We start building software for them Friday after work. Sunday afternoon, we deliver that completed software to the charities. Sleep is optional, caffeine provided. If you're in Phoenix, come join us for the next AZ Give Camp. Or if you'd like a Give Camp where you're connecting from, hit me up on email or Twitter, and let's get a Give Camp in your neighborhood too. Some of the other things that I've done, I do a lot with databases. SQL Source Control Basics was a lot of fun. Mine is Chapter 8. And one of the things I'm particularly proud of, I replied to a .NET Rocks podcast episode. They read my comment on the air, and they sent me a mug. Woo! So there's my claim to fame, my coveted .NET Rocks mug. I'm really glad for Cyril. I get to be a Cyril developer advocate and get to show you really interesting things about Cyril. So this will be a really fun webinar digging into Leaky S3 buckets.
All right, Rob, I can tell you're really ready to jump into this topic, but we're going to have to hold off on the data security and the policy-based zero trust S3 security until I have a few moments to talk about the housekeeping items.
Most definitely.
Take a minute, and afterwards, I'm really interested. Maybe in a few minutes or offline, talk about your the charity activity. Sounds really interesting. But definitely. Let's get back to the webinar. And so first thing, I want the audience to know that we're being recorded. So later today or early tomorrow, it will be available on demand. So you'll receive an email with the link, but at any time, you can go to Security Boulevard to gain access to this webinar on demand, but also to all of the archived webinars. So please take advantage of those webinars we have available. I'm going to take a few moments to comment on the big marker platform we use. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see the chat button. So this feature allows everyone online to comment on today's event. Say hello. Let us know where you're from. We encourage the feedback. We want the feedback. Communicate information about your experiences and provide some insight on what's being said here. Now, for questions, please don't use the chat area, but go to the Q&A tab so that identifies for us to identify that it's a question that you'd like answered. We'll try to get to, Rob mostly will try to get to as many answers as he can, but if not possible, Cyril will get back to you to follow up. And lastly, further to the right, you'll see some handout buttons. There you can download white paper and some other additional information that Cyril has put available for you. Now, at the end of today's webinar, we will be awarding 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stay with us till the end to see if you're selected. So now, Rob,
that'll be so fun. Do I get one?
We'll see if you get selected.
How do I enter for the drawing?
I've yet to see a speaker get one, but who knows? There's always the first time.
Oh, by all means, let's give it to the people who need it most.
So now it's time to jump into today's session, Rob. The floor is all yours. Take it away.
Very nice. I am so excited that we get to talk about Leaky S3 buckets. S3 is really interesting in that it's really difficult to secure S3, but it's really easy to use. And in that boundary between ease of use and security, it's really easy for us to end up in an awkward spot. Here's the part where I tell you I am definitely going to post the slides on my site tonight. You may go look tonight, tomorrow, next week, next month. I've been that person chasing the speaker. I emailed him in about 3 months. He replied in about 6 months. No, I'll definitely post them on my site tonight. Which is why you can go to robrich.org right now. Click on presentations right here at the top. And here's Leaky S3 buckets. The presentation is online right now. As soon as the video on demand is available, then there will also be a play button here where you can get to the video right away as well. Head out to robrich.org, click on presentations, and you'll see Leaky S3 bucket slides online right now. Achievement unlocked. While you're there, you can click on About Me, and we talked about the things that I'm doing. I'm really grateful for Cyril for sponsoring this webinar. And let's dig into Leaky S3 buckets. So we talked about this guy, Leaky S3 buckets. I'm here in S3, and I want to create some buckets. Let's create a new bucket. I'll call this Cyril bucket 4, and I'll go create it. And of course, because we just want to get this online, I'll next come in and I'll go to my security credentials and I'll pop up my details. I'll open up my access keys. I'll go create a access key and secret. I'll put that in my app and I'm done. Well, kind of. What's unique about S3 is that this access key and secret is not specific to that bucket, that data store, but rather it's specific to my user. And anything my user can do is anything this access key and secret can do. So that's not great. We don't want to give them the ability to, I don't know, spin up extra instances, EC2 instances or extra containers. So, well, let's try again. Let's go create another bucket. So I want to secure this a little bit. Cyril bucket 3. Well, should I unblock all access? No, I love that they make us check the box to see how to do that. How would I secure this bucket? Well, I really can't do that here as I create it. Okay, so let's create that bucket. And now let's come back in and we'll take a look at that bucket and see how we might secure it. I'll come in here to permissions. Here's those permissions where we could just come in and turn off all the things. I love that we'll get this box that says, hey, that's a really bad idea. So let's not do that. Let's come back to our bucket, our permissions. Okay, so I'm familiar with an access control list. Let's come in here and see if we can secure our bucket with an access control list. I'm going to come in here to edit. Yeah, I could definitely give everyone permission. That's a bad idea. I could give particular groups permissions. So I want to add a new thing. I'm going to come back up here to my roles, and I'll come pick a particular role. Let's pick this role. And inside this role, we'll go grab the role details, and we'll come back here into the bucket. Let's enter that role ID. I'll give that role some permissions, and we'll see that, yeah, that didn't work. Bummer. Now, the reason that this doesn't work is that this is not specific to a role within my subscription, but rather a different subscription. This is how I might choose to link accounts together. Now, in this case, that's not what I'm looking for. So let's keep looking. Well, okay, so let me go create another bucket. Let's create Cyril bucket 6. And well, configuration is hard, so I accidentally put it in the wrong location. Good luck finding that one again. In this case, S3 is global, but it's really easy to create resources in other environments, in other regions. So let's go put that in the correct region, US East 1. And now we'll be ready to go. So we've got our bucket, and they're all over the place. That's pretty cool. We've got our bucket, and we want to secure it back here in permissions. Access control list definitely wasn't it. We don't want to give it public access. That wouldn't be a good idea. Here's bucket policy. Let's start playing with bucket policy. That might be interesting. So there's a policy generator. That's cool. Now, in this case, this is an S3 bucket policy. I want to allow it. What's the principal? There's my role that I want. I could specify a particular user as well. And now I'm on S3. There's the danger button. Inside of here, let me pick some permissions. So I want to be able to get object and get object permissions. I want to be able to put object and put object permissions. And I also want to be able to list the contents of the bucket. So let's come up here and we have a list all my buckets and list bucket. The bummer part is that list bucket is actually specific to the bucket, but at first glance, that feels like listing the buckets. Okay, so I've got my actions that I want to be able to do. I can give it a resource name, let's say ARN, AWS S3, my bucket name, Cyril bucket 1, and I could specify all of the files in it or the bucket itself. Let's add that statement. Okay, here's the policy that it created for me. Now this is interesting. Let's come back here in this policy editor and we'll paste that into place and let's click save and this errors. I love this error because this error is so, well, unhelpful. I don't know, it broke. Well, the problem here, and it's not super obvious, is that some of these permissions apply to the bucket itself and some of them to the contents of the bucket. So I may need to say this goes to the contents of the bucket, and I may need to say this goes to the bucket itself. Let's separate these statements into two different statements where we can specify the different permissions in different places. So here, these permissions affect the bucket contents. So there's the bucket contents. And this list bucket is the one where, yes, thank you, Tony. This one just goes on the bucket itself. Now we can go save the changes and now it'll work. Oh, now it won't work. Did I leave an extra dangling, comma. Yes, typing is hard. There we go. Now we've got a bucket policy. Now it took us a while to build up that bucket policy. And if we go look at our buckets, well, that one's secure. But all the rest of these are kind of, well, not. That configuration was a little bit obscure to do. But now that we've got that content in place, let's see if we can use it. Now, I've loaded up some secrets previously, just so that I can get this content into place. So now we need to assume the role that is given permission to this resource. I'll start out by clearing my environment, clear out all the environment variables that I've got. I have this as a shell script that will just go nuke all those environment variables, and also as a PowerShell script that will just remove those. Okay, so now that we've got a clean environment, AWS STS assume role, I'll give it that role ARN, and that is ARN AWS IAM. I'll put in my subscription ID and role/native. That's the role that I was after. I'll give it the role session name of AWS CLI session. And unfortunately, this will output the environment variables to the console. So let's not do that. I built a script that will hide the values just so we don't get them onto the screen today. And here's that shell script as a bash script. So now it grabbed my account and I just hard coded it there so I didn't have to remember it. And I pass in the role name and it will assume that role, set the environment variables, and then get my caller identity just to validate that I've done it correctly. Here's this as a bash script and also as a PowerShell script that will just go grab that JSON, grab the pieces out of the JSON and set those environment variables. Okay, so let's do that. I will say assume role and I will do the role of native. And now that I've assumed that role, I now have permission to get at that particular bucket. Yep, AWS STS get caller identity. I am now that native role. If I go grab this command, just making sure that it didn't get set only in that subshell. If we're in bash, we need to do a /assume role.sh just to make sure that we're not creating a subshell where we set the environments in the subshell and come back out. So we've got this content. Now let's go use it. AWS S3 LS. Let's take a look at the bucket. Cyril bucket 2. Now, right now the bucket is empty. So let's copy a file into place. AWS S3 CP. I will grab this owl.jpg and I will copy it into place there in Cyril bucket 2 owl.jpg. And I have permissions to be able to copy it into this bucket. So that worked great. Let's list the bucket again. And now we have that file in place. Let's download that file. AWS S3 CP. I'll go grab this file and let's download it as download.jpg. And that worked out great. Now, in creating this permission, the policy, and also in building the role, we didn't check the remove item from bucket. So if we were to say AWS S3 RM, and let's go try to remove this, then we get an access denied. That's interesting. We weren't able to do this action. Now, how do we know that this exfiltration attempt was blocked? Well, the logs ended up somewhere probably, but we don't have any context about who did this action. All we know is this AWS STS get caller identity. All we know is that they are the role native. Okay, that's interesting, but we've kind of lost that context. So let's clear out our environment. Clear environment. And let's take a look at some of the things that we saw so far. I was really good at doing a really bad job of inconsistent setup. As we started to use it, we needed to know the role name. And in particular, we had to assume that role. And once we assumed it, we set environment variables that were in our shell, which could easily spill into the next command. Perhaps I need to switch between roles and I have the old role loaded up, so I'm not able to do my job. Yeah, that was awkward. We need to duplicate our roles and the access logs are somewhere. The interesting thing here, though, is that for as much as I spent time here in S3, and I've got my users in AWS, really, my user store of choice is here in Azure. I'm using Azure Active Directory as my primary user store. And so I really need to replicate all of my users and roles here inside of AWS. Well, you can see I'm not very far through this process. I've only got one user so far. Yeah, copying users back and forth between AWS and Azure has become really burdensome for me. I'd really love a tool to be able to automate that away, or perhaps we need to just not do that. Duplicating roles and users is hard. So that's securing an AWS bucket piece. Well, we start out creating a user and then we add a policy to that user. We may add that user to a particular role. So here I'm starting to create the role, and then I give my role a policy. Here's where I can specify the S3 bucket permissions that I want to give it, perhaps specifying the S3 bucket name, and then I can select a trusted identity. And finally, I attach the policy to the role. I finish creating the role and I assign the user to the role. And when I'm done, now I can do that STS assume role. Now that's cool. I got logged in as that particular role, but now I'm starting to leak these secrets into my shell. Well, yeah, we're exposing the secrets to the users, but we're also leaving those in the shell until the user happens to clean them out. So how would we solve this with S3 tools? Well, AWS Macy is really interesting in being able to identify content in S3 buckets to be able to take a look at our files and understand what's in it. We could use the policy generator to generate some policies that give us more control over things. But we saw as we used that policy editor, the policy generator, that it didn't actually generate a policy that was really durable. We did need to tweak it and kind of adjust it to our needs. Now, once we got the users and the roles and the policies and the trust relationships in place, it wasn't too bad. And we can use the roles, access key, and secret in our application. So we're doing okay. But, well, the tools built into AWS really aren't up to snuff for being able to secure our leaky S3 buckets. So how do we do this? As we're designing these roles and policies, we kind of have two choices. Now, in our case, we designed one policy that applied to all buckets. Now, we could do this pretty universally because we could say this policy applies to everything and I only need to define it once. Alternatively, we could define a specific policy for a specific bucket and really tune that to the needs of that particular use case. As we look at these two, there's no real magic sauce here. Each one kind of has pros and cons. If I create many policies, I can really tune each policy to the use case. I can adjust it to secure a particular bucket. I can adjust it for particular user needs, and I can really tune it to make it ideal with least privilege necessary. On the downside, I now need to remember to configure it in each bucket that it needs to apply to. We saw as we configured the buckets that, well, it was really easy to miss that configuration. By comparison, if we have one policy, we can have that one policy apply to all buckets. Now that's interesting. We don't then need to apply it to each bucket, but we also need to make this policy the most permissive of all of the use cases. So if anyone needs to do anything with any of these buckets, we need to be able to allow them to do their job. The really frustrating part is when we start to tune these policies and people are like, I just need to do my job. Can you just push the turn off security button so I can get this done? Yeah. One policy for all is the easiest to apply, but the least secure. By comparison, many policies allow us to tune to specific use cases, but we need to apply them consistently. So let's double click into that. The inconsistent setup problem. Well, in our case, we were just clicking through the UI to go create some content. We could use tools for this that might make it so that we can provision things more consistently. Perhaps we're using CloudFormation templates or a Terraform script. Now, the beautiful thing here is that we can bake into our Terraform script all the particulars of how we want to set up our bucket and all of our users and roles and trust relationships, and we can really tune it. But, well, there's a lot going on in these Terraform scripts. So here's a script that will set up all of the pieces and get all of the stuff involved. And while you're seeing how long this is, you probably missed the whole point that this actually is a ARM template that sets up a Cosmos database. It is not a CloudFormation template. Let's switch over to a CloudFormation template that will set up the users and the roles and the buckets. And with a policy like this, we can start to build out the details that we need to be able to automatically configure it. But, well, there's a lot going on in this script. And so tuning the script and keeping it up to date is kind of intense. As users come online, we'll need to add them to the role, and we'll need to be able to remove them for the role. This CloudFormation template is kind of intense. The logs. Now, we didn't look at the log viewer yet, but, well, here from the docs on Amazon, we can see that the logs are delivered on a best effort basis. Most requests for a bucket that is properly configured for the logging result in a delivered log record. Most log records are delivered within a few hours of the time that they are recorded, but they can be delivered more frequently. The completeness and timeliness of server logging is not guaranteed. Here's the link to that. As you grab these slides from robrich.org, you can click through this blue link to get to the actual Amazon policy that identifies their S3 access logs. So let's summarize what they've highlighted. It's delivered on a best effort basis. It's probably delivered, and it's probably delivered within a few hours. Now, if we're using these logs to try to block exfiltration attempts or other attacks on our S3 buckets, well, the user's long gone by the time we get the logs. So pretty much all we can do with these access logs is a postmortem to understand what we lost. We can't do very much to actively block any attempts at our data. Well, that's too bad. Let's flip over and take a look at, and we also need to sync our users and roles. We saw how I was only about halfway through, maybe a third of the way through, grabbing all of the users from Azure and setting them in place in Amazon. This process of syncing users is awkward and manual and kind of like a Pokeball. You have to remember to catch them all. At the point where a user is leaving, I'll probably lock them out of their Active Directory account as I start that conversation. And I'll probably forget to also lock them out of the Amazon account. So maybe they still have those environment variables set in their shell. Maybe they still have access to the Amazon S3 buckets. That's not ideal. So let's find a way where we can just not sync users. Let's use our Azure Active Directory users and use that to secure our AWS S3 resources. Let's take a look then at that ideal scenario. What do we want from this mechanism? What is the best case scenario for securing this S3 data? We probably want a federated identity solution, something where we can tie into our identity provider and use that as our system of record. Maybe the data is automatically synced, or maybe we're just going to use that identity in the other places where we need it. We need access logs. We need them delivered consistently, reliably, and quickly so that we can use those access logs to be able to identify things like exfiltration attempts. We want to use the logs to block unusual activity. And ideally, we'll have some automation that will make it possible for us to get consistent setup and consistent security of our S3 content. That's our ideal solution. Let's add Cyral and see if we can get this to happen. Cyral enables federated access control, consolidated policies and monitoring, and real-time attack response that allows us to really see the content coming into our S3 bucket and make decisions in real time to be able to block unauthorized access. With Cyral, we can use various access control providers. In this case, we'll use Azure Active Directory, but we could also use Okta or Auth0, GSuite, and many more. We can also use this mechanism to secure lots of data stores. Today, we're looking at S3, but we could also use this with Postgres or MariaDB, with Oracle or SQL Server, or lots more. Ultimately, when we're using this, we can get our logs to go into that location where we're already storing logs. Today, we'll see logs in CloudFormation, but we could also send them to an Elk or a Splunk cluster or wherever you're storing your logs. So let's take a look at doing exactly that. Now, I've got my Cyral setup already ready to go. And here I've got my data repository ready, and I'm securing various data stores. In this case, let's dig into the S3 data store. Now, I've got this hooked up to my AWS role so that I'm using that to authenticate into my S3 bucket. I've also specifically mapped this from my Azure Active Directory role, my Active Directory group rather, into that particular role in S3. So I'm using my Azure Active Directory authentication details to secure my AWS S3 data store. That's perfect. So let's take this for a spin. I'm going to clear my environment, and then let's use this mechanism to authenticate. Now, I've got this mechanism, this authentication piece, gimme DB token installed, and gimme DB token will allow me to authenticate into this portal. Let's do that. Gimme DB token S3. I'm going to go to the address of my portal. And I'll set a profile. I'll just call it sidecar. There's nothing magic about the sidecar profile name, but I kind of like that name. And now it will pop open the website. Now it'll first hit Azure Active Directory and grab my authentication details, ask me to log in if I'm not already. And then finally, it's got my token fetched. I can now close this page. Perfect. So now that I've got that token set, I can do an AWS. Now that I've got that token set, I'm able to get into my data store. So I'm going to set some environment variables that will allow me to proxy in through the Cyral data store to be able to get at my S3 bucket. I'm setting my HTTP proxy to that Cyral sidecar that I've got set up. And I'm also giving it a certificate bundle. Since I'm logging securely into the Cyral sidecar rather than S3 itself, then I need to use the Cyral CA bundle. Okay, so now that I've got those environment variables in place, AWS S3 LS, S3 Cyral bucket 2, and I will give it the profile sidecar. That Cyral sidecar profile, if I pop open my AWS folder in my user directory, I'll probably have a file not that unlike this. Here's my default file, and obviously this isn't the real one, but I created this sidecar profile that has that token set from gimme DB token. Perfect. So we can see as we authenticate with that profile sidecar that we've got that data in place. Okay, so let's upload some new files. Let's copy owl.jpg into this S3 bucket. And I will call it owl.jpg. Give me profile sidecar. And now in this case, I'm doing an update because that file already exists. But we can see that that worked out just fine. Okay, so I can download the file as well. Let's copy this file from its spot in S3 to download 2.jpg profile sidecar. And that works just fine. And let's try to destroy some data. I'm going to say rm. Let's go delete this, and we'll give it a profile of sidecar. Now, in this case, we can see that this data deletion attempt was blocked. Now, not only was it blocked, but we get the user that tried to block it. It says we don't have permission to access the required resource. Now, in this case, here in S3, I created this role that has specific permissions into my S3 bucket. And I'm using that role to connect from the Cyral sidecar. Now, I could have definitely dialed out the permissions here, but here in the permissions, it's just a normal policy. How did I dial this into place? Here with a data map. Now, this data map identifies the type of data that I have in various places. Now, I could enumerate where I have emails stored, or maybe credit card numbers. Maybe I'm identifying PII or HIPAA data. In this case, I chose to mark this as sensitive. Now, I identified some data inside Postgres that is also sensitive. But here in the S3 repository, I identified that this bucket that we've been using is sensitive. All the data in this bucket is, well, treated as sensitive. Now, let's create a policy that allows us to secure this data. I've identified that this policy targets sensitive data. I've identified the Azure Active Directory group that this applies to. And I've identified read updates. Perhaps I could do selects and deletes, or deletes as well. And in this case, I'm giving you permission to read and update this sensitive data for a maximum of 5 rows at a time. Now, because I didn't specify a delete permission, delete is blocked. Now, the beautiful thing here is that as users get added to Azure Active Directory, they're allowed to make requests into my AWS S3 bucket. As they're removed from Azure Active Directory, they're removed automatically from access to S3. This data policy allowed us to very specifically identify and very granularly identify the access that we have to these particular buckets. So let's flip over to CloudWatch and take a look at the logs. Now I've dialed it into 30 minutes. Let's refresh. And here we can see the activities that I did. Now, we started out doing list objects. I listed objects inside Cyral bucket 2. And we can see not only the user who did this, here's my user that authenticated into Azure Active Directory. We also see the Azure Active Directory group. And we also see the Amazon AWS role. So this user from this group to this role accomplished this action. And in this case, it succeeded. The policy was not violated. Next, we did an upload. So here's that upload, put the object, and that also succeeded. Next up, we did read of the bucket and for sensitive information, and that succeeded as well. And the last thing we did was this one. Let's close a few of these, and let's take a look at this last one. So in this last one, we tried to delete sensitive data. We wanted to delete this file, and in this case, it violated this policy. Policy is violated. We still have the user details, the user, the Azure Active Directory group, the Amazon AWS role, and all of the context associated with that query so that we can be able to take further action. But in this case, because we were using this Cyral proxy, we blocked that attempt. And so that data was not actually deleted. Perfect. So what did we see here? Well, we saw some really elegant mechanisms, attribute-based policies focusing on the nature of our data, not just identifying who the user was that could authenticate it to it, but also being able to catalog our data stores and identify the pieces that we want to secure in specific ways. Now, we could centralize these policies either in the Cyral dashboard or in a Git repository, and we could use GitOps to automatically apply that to our data store. We identified sensitive data so that we could highlight the different pieces that we needed to secure. And we applied that consistently across all of our data stores. So in this case, as we were looking at this policy, we didn't need to specify that this was specific to our S3 data store. This secures our Postgres data store equally as well. Here's another example of a policy. If you grab these slides from robrich.org, you can probably copy and paste this into your portal as well. Now, in this case, I'm identifying that I'm going to secure email, credit card numbers, and social security numbers. Now, rather than identifying groups, in this case, I chose to enumerate the users that this policy applies to. And we can see that in this case, Bob, Tom, and Alex are able to read data, but only the credit card number data. They're not able to see email or social security number, and a maximum of 5 rows at a time. For different identities, Alice and Jeff, they're able to read the email and credit card number, but not social security number. And they're able to update the email, but they're not able to delete. That's perfect. We're able to really dial in the policies that we need and have that apply to all data stores universally. Cyril is really great at enabling us to grab our user identity and pass it all the way through. In a traditional data store, we might have a JWT, and that JWT authenticates to our data store or to our microservice, but our microservice uses a service account to go to our data store. In this case, we could take that JWT, and inside of our microservice, we could pass that same identity off to the Cyral proxy to be able to get at that database. From there, we could log not only the user that attempted to do it, but also the role that we used to get into the final data store, and if that request was successful or what policy it violated. Cyril is great at being able to do real-time attack response, We saw how that delete was blocked without any manual intervention. We have consolidated policies and monitoring and federated temporal authentication to be able to authenticate to the data stores in real time and block those things that you've identified aren't necessary. Cyral is a great system for being able to stop the leaky S3 buckets. Whether we choose to use policy generator or Terraform templates, at the end of the day, we don't necessarily know what data is stored in our buckets, and we really need to take that additional step to be able to get it in place. If you're watching this video later and you see questions that come to mind, or if you're thinking about this tomorrow and want to hit me up, grab me on Twitter at Rob_Rich or at Cyril Inc. And you can grab these slides right now at robrich.org. For those of us who are here in the room, what are your questions? What are your thoughts? What did I miss?
So thank you, Rob. And yes, please enter questions into the Q&A section. But before we move on to the questions, I have a little real-time feedback for you, Rob. And security and identity are normally serious, dry topics. But I must say, your presentation is done in a manner that is enjoyable and easy to consume. So I gained some useful tidbits on how to improve authentication and logging. The cloud providers are doing the lowest common denominator solutions, right, for a mass market. So security needs to be improved with the additional capabilities. And I think Cyral has some of those that provide that. And for more information about the topic, I'm sure you can go to cyral.com. So Rob, it looks like you're up for answering some questions, and we have about 10, 15 minutes. So you ready for some questions? And again,
most definitely.
For the audience, please use that Q&A tab and submit them. So the first one I want to pull out here is, what makes AWS's assume role command so dangerous?
Ooh, good call. When we were looking at the assume role command, we saw a few things. We saw that it leaked credentials into the console. We saw that it was really easy to leave those environment variables longer than we needed to. And we saw that the user really needed to remember a lot of stuff to be able to use that. They needed to know which role name and which AWS account they needed to log into. All of that was a lot for the user to remember. Log into the right account and role name, clear the role once we're done. And it's really easy for us to accidentally forget to clear those variables. From an administrative point of view, it was also really dangerous because, well, they're assuming a role. And if an employee leaves, how do I lock them out of that? If they left the environment variable set, they still have access to that role. Now I could definitely roll the credentials for that role, but now I need to pass that data off to all the other users who still need to get their jobs done. It was pretty difficult to keep all of those secrets in check when we had user changes or even a user trying to accomplish multiple tasks across different roles.
All right. Yeah, it's a difficult issue, it looks like. One of the things that you brought up that I was really surprised with, and one of our audience was kind of saying the same thing, is that, the logs are best case. What was the word? What's the word?
They're delivered on a best effort basis.
Best effort.
And that's kind of fragile. I don't want to assume that they'll get delivered and make that a core principle of my security posture.
Yeah, well, especially the question from Thomas is, how do I use the logs to pass the security audit then if they're best practice? Or is there, what's the other solution?
Exactly. When you hit that audit concern, you'll probably pull up your database logs and, well, yeah, they were delivered on a best effort basis. Hope that works out. Add to that probably the majority of the traffic in our database logs is using our Surface account from our applications. So it's about that point when I say, well, I know that only this application accesses this data store. So let me give you the access logs to my application. That has the actual end user credentials. And let's pretend that the access logs for my application are sufficient to document the access logs for my database. Now that's an assumption. And if ever there's a DBA who needs to just go fix something, I didn't account for that in my audit at all. Hope the auditor didn't notice. And that's where the Cyral logs are really helpful, because we logged all of the details, not only the user who assumed the role, but also the group in that original data store and the role in the destination repository as well.
All right, great. Questions are all over the board here. And so Sherry wants to know, and you kind of mentioned it, but wants to know that implementing different identity stores, identity providers like Okta and Okta, I guess it says Auth0.
Auth0.
Auth0. Is there a difference in the roles, or is it kind of set up in Cyril? How does that work?
That's great. Let's flip over to the Cyral dashboard and take a look at it. When I click on integrations, we have the list of all of the integrations. And so if I wanted to hook up Okta, I would just click setup and it would walk me through that process. Now, the cool thing is, whether I'm using Okta or Auth0 or GSuite or Azure Active Directory or any other authentication provider, I'll need to go create an application in that system. So let's come back to Azure Active Directory, and I will go to Enterprise Applications. And so I set up this enterprise application. Now, the particulars of this application are specific to Azure, but I would do a similar process. I would create an application inside of Auth0 or inside of Okta or inside of GSuite, and then I would put those credentials here into the integration section inside of Cyral. At that point, those two are connected. Once I've got that identity provider here in my data repository, I can pick the identity that I want to map from my source to my destination. And this could either be, in this case, an Azure Active Directory group, or I could specify a list of users. It's usually easier when we pick a group, because now we can manage all of the roles and permissions and all of those particular details inside of our identity provider. That's really what it's for. So let's move those details into our identity provider and then just hook in the link inside of Cyral to be able to use that to authenticate into our data store. Great question.
Yeah, that sounds like when you were talking about, one of the problems is missing users and stuff. This kind of tries to avoid that, right? Because you're using the Active Directory and the authentication stores together.
Exactly. Use your identities where your identities already are, and identify the groups or roles that are allowed to access these data stores inside that identity provider. And whether your identity provider is Okta or Auth0, or in this case, we used Azure Active Directory, you can still set up that mechanism and link it easily to Cyral.
All right. We've had, a lot of breaches and security events in the news in the last, seems like it's forever, but
yes,
and this cloud area and S3 buckets are one area that are being exploited a lot. So Jerry was wondering, how should my company react to a data exfiltration attack?
Good call. Now, that's one of the easiest things that we might get with S3, because we're probably putting a whole lot of unstructured data inside of our S3 buckets. Maybe it's a database backup, maybe it's the salary table, maybe it's that data that we wanted to back up from our data store to keep our data store lean. And once it's up in S3, it's really easy to lose track of it. Now, you can create roles and policies that target specific buckets or perhaps specific key prefixes. And that's one way to go. The policy generator is, not bad at being able to get you started there. But at the end of the day, that's where Cyral policies really tuned that process, where we were able to identify which buckets and key paths had which type of data. And so as we're starting to protect that data, now you'll proxy through the Cyral sidecar and be able to get access to the data that you need while not getting at the data that you don't have access to.
All right, great. So you talked a lot about S3 and the S3 bucket leaks and stuff. But is there other data stores like PostGen or Mongo that are relative to this, or are we only talking about AWS S3 buckets?
In this case, we focused on AWS buckets because that was a fun use case to discover. It also helped us identify the difference between our identity provider and our data store. But the interesting thing here in my setup, I'm actually protecting Mongo and Postgres and S3 and SQL Server. You could also protect other data stores like Snowflake and Oracle. And so probably we have your data store supported.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So, and I suspect, since many organizations have multiple data stores, I know they use multiple clouds and stuff, that Cyril kind of would allow that consolidated policy and audit, right?
Exactly. We noticed that once we identified where our data was in this data map, and we identified what type of data was stored, our policies didn't mention the data store at all. So this policy equally applies to my data inside Postgres and Snowflake as it does inside my data in S3.
Great. So hopefully, it's going to make the security professional a lot more productive and not needing to jump around all over different data stores. So that's great.
And you don't need to be scared of the audit anymore because we've got you covered. We have not only the user that attempted it, but also the group coming from your IDP and the role used to authenticate to your data store.
Very good. Very good. So another question from Brian is, how would I integrate more real-time providers like chat ops, incident tracking, or some real-time approvals?
Good call. Here in the integrations, we were focusing so far on the identity providers. We could also pick from various data stores, but we also have other interesting providers. Slack's chat ops is really fun. I could get my content into Teams for alerting, or I could integrate into Jira to be able to create tickets. I could also integrate into PagerDuty is a really good one, where I can identify in PagerDuty when somebody comes online. And when they're at work, when they're on shift, then they have access to the data stores. And when they're not on shift, they don't. These types of integrations are all available here in the integrations, and it goes for a while, but you can integrate into lots of different pieces and do chat ops or alerting through various providers.
All right. So I suspect that if I went to Cyral.com, I could find out all the different integrations that you have and partners.
Definitely. And if there's an integration that you really need that we don't support yet, let us know. Hit me up on Twitter at Rob_Rich, or hit us up at Cyral Inc. on Twitter, or send us an email from Cyral.com, and let's see if we can build the integration that you need too.
Okay, so we do have one more question from Satish, and he likes the implementation and the examples of the sensitive attributes. But do you see your customers leveraging this capability to enforce data classification policies? So across the different data stores, as we kind of were speaking about.
Most definitely. And that's what's great about this is I'm creating that data classification as a means not only of identifying my data, but also of securing the data. To create that policy, I'm going to identify the data type. And so it just becomes natural to do a data classification. Now, sometimes that data classification can take a while. So in time, it would be nice if we could automatically identify your data. Now, that's not perfect. Machine learning models are only so good. So you may want to be able to tweak that to exactly meet your needs. And that's where the data classification here is just really cool. I come in here to data map and I identify all of my data stores and what type of data is in each place. Now, I don't need to enumerate all my fields. You notice that I'm not identifying the user ID field. That isn't something that I'm worried about. But I can identify this email field and really tie into, I definitely don't want that email getting out without protection.
All right. So, Rob, this has been great, but like all great things, they have to come to a close. So But before I close today's session, it is time to announce the winners of the 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So today's attendees who are selected are Rodell M., Eric Y., Jane C., and Thomas M. So
Congratulations to everyone for winning.
And you know, it's useful. Buy a book, learn about other aspects of security, or whatever you want to do with your $25 at Amazon. So you will receive an email to the email address that you registered this webinar for. So Rob, I'm sure you like me too. You got 7, 8, 10 email addresses and don't always remember which one it is. So if you don't see it, check your spam folder and it should show up relatively soon. So again, I want to thank you, Rob Richardson, our sponsor, Cyril, and especially to you, our audience, for taking an hour out of your time to spend with us. Goodbye, and may the fickle finger of fate look favorably upon you.